You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris?
Hello, and thank you for joining me for this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. In the previous few episodes, we visited one of the city's most romantic gardens and one of its most romantic smaller museums. So today I wanted to shift things up a bit and visit a different sort of site as we journey to the 10th arrondissement of the city. Ah, the 10th. So central, but home to two of the city's busiest train stations, which leads the district to be a bit on the gritty side. As such, it isn't necessarily the most romantic district in the city. Nevertheless, it has some wonderful gems. In our first tour around the districts in Season 1, we visited one of these, the lesser-known but enchanting Square France-Liszt. If you haven't listened to that episode, I suggest you go back to tune in. Today, we're going to visit what is probably the 10th's most famous site, one which also offers plenty of romance. Grab your sherry. We're going to the Canal St. 20 years ago, few people would have decided to go for a romantic stroll along the canal. The area around the 200-year-old waterway had become rather rough. However, over the last few decades, it has seen a lovely resurgence. Perhaps thanks to its feature in the movie Le Fabuleux Destin d'Amélie Poulain, or simply Amélie in English. And today it's one of the hippest parts of the city, with the canal and its surrounding streets now lined with cool shops, cafes, and restaurants. The picturesque waterway begun in 1802 under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, but was only completed in 1825 after the restoration of the French monarchy. It was commissioned with the aim of bringing fresh water, grain, and other supplies into the city, and was funded on a new tax on wine. The stretch, called the Canal St. is part of a larger system of canals which connects the Ourcq River, found around 100 kilometers north of Paris, to the Seine River within the capital. It begins at the Pont de l'Arsenal, just south of La Bastille, and goes up to the Bassin de la Villette at Stalingrad, and from then on it changes names. Over the course of the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, with the advancement of technology and other means of transportation, the canal's practical uses gradually declined. This led it to be almost completely filled in the 1960s. In fact, its southern half, from Rue du Faubourg du Temple to La Bastille, was covered over by a road, although the water still runs beneath the street via an underground tunnel. To help bring the ambience of the canal to life, I thought I would read a short excerpt from my latest book, There's Only One Paris, Tales from Our Times, which includes a chapter set in and around the canal. It was a mild September afternoon, and quiet along the pretty waterway, the complete opposite to how it was on weekends and evenings, when its banks were brimming with strollers and picnickers. Today, there were only a few scatterings of people, well spaced out along the water's edge. Some were chatting in small groups of friends. Others were sharing a bottle of wine, and a few solitary souls were reading or simply admiring the shimmering waters. The 4.6-kilometer canal was built in the early 19th century by Napoleon in order to bring fresh water into the city. It also connected with a series of other canals and waterways that snake throughout northern France. Now, these were predominantly used by pleasure boats. Like other canals and small roads in France, the Canal St was bordered by tall plane trees, intended to provide shade for travelers. These were just starting to turn orange, announcing the arrival of autumn. Nearing a bend in the canal, Alex passed by a row of colorful shops selling clothing and artsy household items made by local designers. He reached the raised stairway bridge which allowed for foot passage above a canal lock. Alex climbed this and paused for a moment when he reached the top. He looked out at the gentle, glistening water to see if a boat was approaching. He enjoyed watching them go through the lock. But something else caught his eye. Down below, on the side of the old lockkeeper's station, there was a large spray-painted mural. More street art. Alex remembered Design's instructions. He was meant to think about what kind of street art he'd like to do. Alex pondered this on the rest of his short journey home. He followed the canal for another 2 blocks, passing a guitar player, serenading his girlfriend, and an elderly couple soaking up some rays on a sunny bench. As a houseboat floated by, Alex waved to its driver and wondered what it was like living on a boat. He'd only been on a boat once, when his class had taken the boat cruise which went up and down the canal. He especially liked the part when the boat went through the underground tunnel, kind of like the tunnels of the catacombs, but for boats instead. The cruise was fun and all, but he wasn't sure he'd like to spend all his time on a wobbly vessel.
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, which interviews a writer with links to Paris, who then reads an excerpt of their writing. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors.
And now, back to Romancing in Paris.
You too will experience a similar bucolic vibe when you visit the Canal St. It's such an ideal stroll, during which you can pop into some of the area shops or hunt down some of the street art alluded to in the chapter excerpt I just read. You can cross over one of the beautiful footbridges for an oh-la-la romantic moment with your chérie. You might be passing by just at the right time to see one of those boats going through the lock, which will add to the romance. There are various places along the canal to stop for a drink or bite to eat, such as the historic Hôtel du Nord, which was the setting for the 1938 film of the same name by Marcel Carné, which tells the tale of a tragic love story. The hotel has recently been rejuvenated, and it's a nice place for a drink on the terrace, or a meal in its rather attractive dining room, evocative of old-school bistros from the era of the movie. For just a drink, you might like to stop in at Chez Prune, a typical bar du quartier, now popular with the hip crowd which mingles around the area. The eclectic Comptoir Général is another great choice, perfectly evoking the spirit of the 10th, with its funky ethnic decor and mismatched furniture, jungle of plants, and thrift store. It's the area's quirkiest bar. They also serve food if you want to carry on your evening with the groovy tunes that usually play here. If it's a nice day for lunch, you can pick up the creative veggie bowl at Imna Canteen. Or there are plenty of other nice eateries in the area, and you can take your goodies to enjoy them by the water's edge. Alternatively, you can simply pick up some snacks and a bottle of wine and have your own picnic next to the canal. Lastly, if you're looking for an original way to see the canal, take a cruise with Canalrama, a company offering tours that go up and down the canal, departing from either end of it at the Bassin de l'Arsenal or the Bassin de la Villette. It's a good way to learn about the canal's history. Plus, you get to visit the section which goes underground. This adds a special thrill to your date and is the perfect place to steal a kiss. So much romance, whether you visit it by water or on foot. I hope you will enjoy your romantic outing at the Canal St. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you're looking for more cool romantic things to do in Paris, see my website jetaimeneither.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to rate or review it. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.